Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I know some of you are not quite certain why you've got a psychologist speaking to you this afternoon. Or indeed, you know the difference between a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, a psychiatric social worker. The Bishop of Stepney said a psychologist was a man who, when he went to a strip show, preferred to look at the audience. When we meet each other, we say, "You are fine, but how am I?" Do you know how many psychologists it takes to change a light bulb? Just one, but the light bulb needs to want to be changed. And a psychiatrist, that's a doctor who's afraid of the sight of blood. I'm not that type of psychologist. I'm a business psychologist, an organizational psychologist. I do my work in organizations, big organizations or small ones. I do things on culture change and motivation and other sort of things. And I also write for the newspapers. I've had a column in the Financial Times and the Sunday Times, in the Daily Telegraph. And a few years ago, I was described as a business guru. Well, this pleased me enormously, because there's lots of professors, not so many gurus, laws of supply and demand, charge more as a guru. So I phoned my friend up from the Financial Times and said, "Tim, it's fantastic news. They've called me a guru." He said, "Oh, bad luck." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, journalists use the word guru when they can't spell charlatan." I'm going to talk about a topic which is anxiety-provoking for people, and it's the topic of change. Because change hurts. You've heard a lot about change. I'm going to say a few more words about change. But I prefer to use the word progress rather than change. But if you want proof of the fact that change is all about, then you need to rehearse the 3 sexy words to prove you're up to date. You know what the 3 sexy words are? Agile, disruptive, diversity. Use those words 3 times a day, and they'll think you're up to date. But it is a very important issue, this issue around change. Now, I'm an academic, and I write books. I've written 87 books. I'm trying to write 100. As you can see, quite a lot of them. It helps to pass the time as we academics carry on. So there they all are. You'll see one on leadership there. Do you know how many books there are in the English language with the word leadership in the title? There's 87,000. But the good news is there's one good one. But I also go out to the real world as an academic, and I do consulting. There are my clients. Do you see Goldman Sachs? Well, underneath Goldman Sachs is my top client. You might or might not recognize who that is. Does anyone know who that is? It's the Queen. Are you impressed? This is a nice hotel, but I promise you, Buckingham Palace is nicer. Okay, let's get on to the topic. Change. The world is changing. You've seen, by the way, of course, you have all these slides coming to you. I'm going to go through them quite fast. I'm not going to read them out. So you can go through them at your leisure. But we know the world of work is changing a lot. Global competition, reduced supervision, increased cultural diversity, more automation. We know that. We might not like it. We might not know how to deal with it. But we know the workplace is changing dramatically. I got an email this morning. I'm an adjunct professor in Norway as well as in London, and they said all the exams are now going to be digital. I don't even know what a digital exam is, but in the future they're all going to be digital. We also know there are mega trends in society. This is taken from one of the ones I like most of all. Wars will continue to be fought as weapons become more sophisticated. There's a second potential, more dangerous scramble for resources, etc. Some of them are rather worrying. It's more about defending your wealth than increasing your wealth. Education is out of sync with the job market. So we see these sort of slides and these comments of the old world, which is wired, and the new world is wireless. Office hours versus non-office hours. I wish they'd teach British banks that, but that's another story. Corporate headquarters, local centers, etc. Surplus of youth, surplus of wrinklies. The world is a different place. And to be successful, you have to adapt, indeed anticipate that. And as someone said this morning about turning an oil tank around, it's not easy to do corporate culture change. In fact, it's very difficult. I would argue that 80% of these attempts at least in my experience, both an observer and a participant fail. And they nearly always fail because management isn't really behind them. That's the reason why they fail. Management assumes that someone else, HR does it or some consultant does it. We stay okay and don't get involved. So I'm going to say a little bit about the management of people and why that's important for the whole business of not only corporate culture change, but success. The management of people is about recruiting, selecting, engaging, developing, and letting go people. I'm going to say a word about this sexy topic called job engagement and what it means, and why it is so much easier to change an organization which is engaged than one is disengaged. My latest book, I got the proof for it 2 days ago, is called Disenchantment and Enchantment. The idea that things you do to people piss them off. They become disenchanted, disengaged, alienated. And that makes the change of the organization almost impossible. A few years ago, I write a lot of books, and you get interviewed by the BBC. The BBC believe, the British, believe truth comes from argument. You lawyers would understand that. That's why we built our House of Commons, so that we face each other. Red team sits here, blue team sits there. You have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And the BBC believe the same thing. They believe that you have Mr. Nice and Mr. Nasty, or the reviewer who's nice to you, the interviewer, and the interviewer is not nice to you. Well, I had that on the radio, and they go, "Oh, Professor, you've written all these books, Professor, and you wander around the world, Professor, blah, blah, blah," and then it changes. Well, Professor, have you ever been into the real world, Professor? No, I said, I don't know where it is, but I've got a bicycle. I'll go straight there afterwards if you tell me where to go. And they said, all right, you've written books. In fact, I have books as a giveaway gift for clever questions. By the way, a clever question is one I can understand and give an answer to, which makes me look good. He said to me, all right, in the last 10 seconds then, Professor, tell me what you've got to do to be a good manager. Go. That's the BBC for you. So I said, right. I said, there's 3 things you've got to do. Number 1, you've got to set people challenges, targets, KPIs, KRAs. I don't care what you call them. They've got to be very clear what they're supposed to do, and you've got to get them to maximize their abilities and efforts, challenge them to do it better. Can they articulate what they're doing? 2, they need support from you. You are support staff. You provide information, technical support for them to do their job, particularly if they're customer-facing. And next, they need information on how they're doing. I think this is the essence in many ways of a performance management system. And if you really want to privatize a company from going from public sector to private sector, performance management is the way to do it. I was involved in the British Airways case. Read it up, Harvard Business Review. Performance management. These are the principles of performance management. The importance of challenge and support and feedback. Now, I was giving a talk. This is my model. My leadership model, where there's a book to give it away, but I'll go to this slide. Oops, I'll go back to that one. There. I was at a conference in Oman, and the speaker in front of me was a real guru. I know that because he was charging $35,000 for his lecture, and I wasn't. And his name was Buckingham, Marcus Buckingham, very charming man, and he impressed me enormously. I could have bought the book for $9.99 and heard the story. But he was very memorable. He said, there's only 3 types of jobs. Technical jobs, supervisory jobs, strategic jobs. Amen. They hire you for your technical knowledge. This room is filled with degrees. I would imagine there's 150 degrees, maybe more in this room. You go to university, you learn stuff. You know stuff. And they hire you because you know stuff. And you go to work, and you practice your stuff, and you become better at your stuff. And then, what do they do to you, he said? They promote you into not doing your stuff. You're a very, very good public international lawyer, but the reward for being so good is to stop doing that and manage the office. And why do you become a technical person in the first place? Because you didn't like or understand people. No, unfair. But it's not your natural métier. So you're giving people, you're promoting them to manage. They all want to go from technical jobs, from the blue to the yellow. You want to go straight from technical to strategic, because you don't have to deal with people. They're a nuisance. they're a pain in the A. That's the problem with individuals. Capricious, irascible, unpredictable, whinging, etc. And yet, if you can't or won't do that, your chances of corporate culture change are very limited. So the question becomes, what sort of people do you have? What sort of people do you promote to positions of middle and senior management who will carry the burden, or should carry the burden, of the corporate culture change? Now let me say a few words about engagement, because many companies doing surveys, I heard the lady from Toronto earlier speaking about having corporate surveys, and many of them do surveys around engagement. We used to, we psychologists, we used to call it job satisfaction, then we called it job commitment, then we called it job involvement, now we call it job engagement. Do you know why we stopped calling it job satisfaction? Well, we found to our surprise that job satisfaction is really rather heritable. We've got studies of identical twins separated at birth, and you can see how much you inherit job satisfaction. You were told by your HR manager that job satisfaction is a function of your pay and your conditions and your manager. But you know, don't you, of carriers of gloom, heart-sinking staff who wander around like Typhus Mary around the organization with doom and gloom and negativity. And so, in that sense, it's quite a heritable characteristic. But job engagement isn't. Can you see job engagement? How do you look at it? Well, you notice it by high levels of energy in an organization. It's the speed at which things happen, the speed at which people move, their persistence with a problem. This is not staying late because it's the corporate culture requirement to stay late. It's staying late because you're persistent in getting it right. Getting it right first time, getting it right for the client. And there's an enthusiasm and a pride about the organization. Who do you work for? And you are happy to say which organization you work for. I am very proud to say I'm a professor of University College London, the 5th best university in the world and the 4th best in Britain. I'm very proud to say that. It's an indication of my engagement. A sense of empowerment. I can do some stuff. Whatever level I have, I can do some stuff. And I can show some initiative. So engaged staff look different. You can see they're different. They're engaged, they're dedicated, they're challenged. But the question is, how do they get like that? I want to say a few words about motivation, particularly to an audience such as this. I've recently written a book on the psychology of money. And psychologists say that money, if you pay people equitably, differentiating within the organization according to responsibility and output, and market forces, and slightly above, money's not a motivator. Money does nothing for you. If somebody comes to you and says, if you pay people peanuts, you get monkeys, sack them. They don't understand people management at all. And so how do you do this stuff? Well, one of the distinctions, an important one, between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is you do things for the joy of the activity. You do them for the passion and the love and the flow. You don't need to be paid. That's what they say to us academics. They say, we're so engaged with our stuff, you don't have to pay us very much. And by and large, it's true. I'll explain this and illustrate it by a wonderful example of a colleague of mine. He's the cleverest man in my department. He's the world's expert on handedness. And he lives near me in Islington in London. And he had a dilemma. He has a lovely house which overlooks a park. And there are children playing in the park. They're making a lot of noise. He'd like them to go away so he can carry on doing his books. Well, any solutions to that? You could do double glazing. It's expensive. You could work at night. It's not what he wants to do. You could choose another room. He wants to stay there, and he wants the children to go. Well, you could get a Rottweiler. You could play them sounds they don't like. What are the alternatives? You could try the mafia method. You could pay them to go away. What happens? They come back. But he's clever. My colleague went to the park and said, children, I like the sound of your happy voices. I'm going to pay you each £1 to carry on playing. Now, their mommies and daddies had said, don't take money from strange old professors in parks. But they did. And the next day he came into the park, and there were more of them, and he gave them all £1. And on the 3rd day. But, if I can get the Anglican cadence right, but on the 4th day, he went in and said, children, I'm sorry, I haven't been to the bank, I've no money, I can't pay you to carry on playing. Ha! They said, you think we're going to carry on playing for nothing? We're going. You've changed play into work. You've changed joy into labor. Be very careful with money. Be very careful with bribery. It doesn't work. It backfires. And it backfires often in this business of corporate culture change. So, we live in turbulent times. There are 1 million economists in the world. How many predict the 2008 crash? Not a lot. Not a lot. What I found from 2008, of my friends, my consultant friends and my business friends, half of them seemed to do better. Half of them, their companies were strengthened, and half nearly collapsed. And I was fascinated to try and understand why some of them had done so well in bad times, in turbulent times, and others had not. Well, what are turbulent times like? There's a lot of change about it. It hurts, it's uncertain, it's unpleasant and unpredictable and uncontrollable. It's very easy to lead people in good times. Do you remember Mr. Brown just before the 2008 election in England? He said, we've abolished boom and bust. It's very easy to take responsibility for great success when you're doing well. And it's easy to lead people. There's a sense of optimism about you don't have to work so hard, etc., etc. Probability and growth occur. But it's not so good when things fail and things are bad. What do people want of their leader? What do the British want of their prime minister in these difficult times? Well, they want you to be steady and calm under fire. They want you to be defiant and vigilant, that you stake out for your position and you stand there. Have you noticed how many people walk on stage? You have to move like Tony Blair to show you're fit. You've got to be fit. Mrs. May doesn't look so good. You've got to be fit in mind and body. And you've got to be someone who understands business and people. Understanding people and not business is good enough, and the other way around. So the question is turbulent times, is a recession an opportunity or a threat? And what's your mindset? Is your mindset, oh God, how can we deal with this stuff? There's threats from everywhere. There's China in the background doing this, and there's India looming ahead, and we're going to outsource everything? Or do you see it as an opportunity? Well, you might have seen the slide before. I think it's correct. My Chinese PhD student argued that it is, that the word for opportunity in Chinese has two symbols, one danger and the other opportunity. What opportunity do you have? What does disruptive times, changing times, what opportunities have you got? And what's your mindset to change where you can? So let me spend a little bit on culture. I'm very interested in culture. I've written 2 books on culture shock. Those of you who've got a good ear can hear I'm a colonial. I grew up in Africa, and I'm always fascinated. I've just written an article for the Wall Street Journal on why so many entrepreneurs are foreigners. Very interested in the experience of corporate culture and national culture, because the two interact with one another, inevitably. You might be working for a big conglomerate in a country where, I work for Goldman Sachs in India. It's very obviously Goldman Sachs, with an Indian flavor. So sometimes the organization, the powerful culture, can be plonked down in a national culture, and sometimes not. Well, I can say a lot about culture. It's below the surface. I think the definition is simply this. Culture is the way you do things around here. I say to my students, go into an organization. I remember one day I went into Rolls-Royce and McDonald's on the same day as part of consultancy assignments. My God, were they different. Astonishingly different. You could see, just the way security was handled. You see the corporate, you don't have to get an anthropologist or an HR person. You can see it. You can see the corporate, what's important, what's not important. What do people obey? Someone said earlier about the idea that the important part of the culture is that you don't make mistakes. Well, does that end in slightly obsessional perfectionistic culture? Does it mean it becomes OCD? Does it mean it's more important you understand the difference between a colon and a semicolon than the meaning of the sentence? Well, it can do. It's what people reward and punish you for. I say to people at training courses, tell me, is your organization a punishment or a reward culture? Are you here, not here, but on a training course, are you here because you failed something, or are you here because it's a reward? Here is the donkey. You can make the donkey go in that direction by carrots or sticks. And they all say, oh, we're a bit of both. We're both carrots and sticks. And I say, well, tell me about the carrots. Tell me about the sticks. Tell me about the implicit laws you've got to obey. When my wife is at the back, worked for Bain & Company, they actually had an etiquette book about how to behave, how to dress. You were told specifically how you should do these things. Now, you can see this dramatically when you go into organizations. But what I would recommend, and what most consultants would recommend, is you do an audit. You do an audit, there are a few measures of this, and you try and establish the corporate culture you have at the moment, then of course the corporate culture you want, and the disparity between the two. It's what most change consultants would do. Now, how they measure the corporate culture is a different matter. But it's not a good idea for senior executives to go to a nice hotel, pour a few gin and tonics, and talk about their values. The only people who understand the corporate culture are people who've just joined the organization. I don't talk to anybody who's been there more than 6 months. Because where you think it's normal where you work, you think the culture is normal and healthy. And yet it's so unutterably bizarre, the things you've picked up, the behaviors, the values that you absorb and respond to. Now, I don't know if you know the work by a man called Hofstede. You can Google this, it's fantastic. Hofstede is a Dutch psychologist, Geert Hofstede, and he's got a website, and he's interested in national culture. You can put in here, because I'm doing some work in Norway and Tanzania and United Kingdom, you can actually put in the countries you're playing with, and up comes the differences. And they're good enough. It's Hofstede culture, if you're interested. And he says, for instance, there's, what's the first one? Power distance. So one of the issues with corporate culture is the extent you relate to people according to their rank and status. I deal with the British Army a lot. I'm astonishingly impressed with senior military officers. They're extremely clever. I know they're extremely clever. I give them intelligence tests. They're very smart. But in the army, of course, how I react to you is a function of my rank. I am, for the day, an honorary colonel. I hope you're impressed. I rather like it. But in some cultures, you notice this when you go maybe to parts of Asia, to India, people are very conscious of rank and status. They're not at all conscious of rank and status in Norway or in Scandinavian countries. And you can insult people and humiliate them by not being sufficiently differential. These are corporate, these are national culture, but they can also come into corporate culture. And so you can, as I said, here is the United Arab Emirates, where I do quite a lot of work for Emirates Airline and the United Kingdom. So what's it like going to negotiate from being an Emirati with a Briton? Or what is it British like? How do you start that game? So this is national culture. But interestingly, you can use these dimensions. The one is individualism, collectivism, a big difference between the East and the West. Huge difference. I used to do some work at Hong Kong business schools. So I'd say to my students there, you have an assignment. Would you like to do it in a group? Oh, yes, they said. And you speak good English, you're good at presentation, you're good writing. We'll be a group and take the average result. Collectivism. I said that to my British students. Oh, no, thank you. Don't trust him. He's a lazy sod. Love many, trust a few, always paddle your own canoe was my father's advice. So that's another dimension. So we can take this in terms of corporate culture and national. We can define it and measure it. It's not difficult, and it's relatively reliable because you do it in terms of actual behaviors. Now, I want to spend time on the next 3 sets of slides. So, you're worried about your corporate culture. You're worried that you are not as client-sensitive as you might be. You're worried that some of your very clever professional people don't seem to be as entrepreneurial as they should be. You're worried that people are marching to a different drum. So what are you going to do? Well, the question is where you begin, where you intervene. So what this slide says is there's a number of ways you can start. So you might go for the technology. I remember doing some work in How long have I got? Yes, I've got 10 minutes. This is... Anyway, I'll carry on until they start dragging me off. I remember doing some work in the Philippines, and we couldn't get the people to leave their golf ball typewriters alone. So we went in at the weekend and dragged the typewriters out, the boss and I, and put computers on their screens. Technology changes a great deal, and you can use technology. You can use value re-engineering and all that stuff. Technology might be the way you begin the process of changing the corporate culture. It might be that you structure the company differently. I know a man who runs a company who says, every 3 years we restructure. It's the best way of getting rid of the dead wood. You fiddle the company. This is very serious, not just somebody tinkering from HR. It's the boss saying, I remember him saying, he said to me, I love this phrase, he said, you know what I do with the difficult people? I form a subsidiary, give them fancy titles, and sell it. I know everyone could do this. So you can play with the structure. You can play with the tasks people do. You can increase specialization or decrease specialization. You can try fiddling around with the people. You can have a selection process. You can have training. You can have ways in which you try and give people a new mindset or only choose people with a specific mindset. You might want to change the culture. How that is done is always problematic. You might think, strategy. Many organizations used to have a strategy department, and they don't have strategy departments anymore. But the strategy, if you change the strategy, everything should follow. Or you change the objectives of individuals. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of these, but you have choice. You have choice to go in. And of course, some people will automatically say, technology is the stuff that works, because I understand technology and I'm a technocrat. Change the technology, you change the culture. Well, maybe. Change the structure, change the culture. Maybe. Change the people. So there's options to you, and they need to be thought through and rationalized, which you use. The second issue is the particular change strategy you might use. I've seen organizations use many of these, and I'll just speak them. It's working now. Very quickly. The first is the fellowship strategy. This strategy says, change hurts. People need to talk. People need to sit around and say about what worries them, because it worries a lot of people. And the fellowship strategy is saying, it's an affect. We are people of the head and people of the heart, and let's do a bit of talk. Let's do communication. Let's do worry talk. Good idea, fair enough, but when does it end? When does it stop being group therapy? 2, what about the political strategy? Harold Wilson. Find the people who are on side, the people who are with the strange strategy. Come to me, come to my office, beer and sandwiches, and let me work on you, because you are the carriers, the emissaries of the news. The trouble with the political strategy, you say, in the new company, we're not going to be political. We're going to be open and transparent. And you're using a political strategy to stop being political. Then there's the economic strategy. You can bribe people. People will go with money. You can get them out with a big enough salary. I remember working with the manager of the Mandarin chain, and he was their chief change agent. And he'd wander around for a month, then he'd make a decision who's staying and who's going, and you went to the CEO's office, there was the CEO, a lawyer, and a plastic bag. And you were gone in half an hour. There was the CFO as well. You can use money, short term, to stop things happening. You can use the academic strategy. You can get people to write reports, get in clever people, pay them lots of money. I remember doing some work for an organization in Australia. It was amazing. They paid, it was Tower's parent such a long time ago, $50,000 a month this organization was spending on the consultants writing reports. And they were damn good reports. The trouble is, the people didn't understand them, and by the time the reports were out, they were out of date. I remember going to Australia to try and attempt to explain to somebody what it meant. Academic analysis paralysis. You can do the engineering strategy we've talked about. You can use the military or the confrontational strategy. The idea is to try and find a strategy, a way of dealing with hearts and hands, of dealing with power. All of these have something useful in them as a strategy to implement something where you've decided to go in first via the structure and then via the people or whatever. Now, have you ever met am I going the wrong way? I'm going the wrong way. One of you might have come across Kotter. Every change agent has read Kotter and his 8 strategies. And I think they're fine. It's quite out of date now. I remember speaking to him 20 years ago. And he says, if you want to put in place a change strategy, then there are a few things you should do. One, create some sense of urgency. Not postponed now. Today is the first day of the rest of your life. We're in a bad way. Create some sense of urgency. Get the right team. Get the right team to carry the message. It's a good idea that they come from various departments. They need to be believers. They need to be supported by management. But the change team is very important. Develop a vision, a very simple vision. You don't need anything enormously complex. The more complicated it is, the more difficult it is. A simple phraseology of what you're aiming to do. Tesco's got to number 1 by being number 2. Well, that's another story, but their strategy was to be number 1. And they did it. That was the strategy. Develop the vision you want of the people. Then, of course, there's the communication of the vision. This needs to be clearly articulated by people who believe in that. And this is nearly always senior management. I remember at BA, I remember Lord King and Ayling, what was his name, I can't remember, every single training, they played a huge importance to their performance management program. And on a Friday afternoon, Lord King pitched up, the boss, the CEO, to say how things were going. People were astounded. People were astounded because they remembered him being there. He said, I want this done, and he was there to show it. Unless senior management show it very clearly and don't leak the idea. We psychologists use the word leak when you can detect dishonesty or insincerity. That they are quite behind the program. Remove the obstacles where you can. They come in various forms. Create short-term wins, always very attractive. Elaborate on the change. Do not declare victory too early. Change programs never stop. The interesting thing about my generals and what makes them so extraordinary compared to business people walk in and they say, well, I don't need to be training. I've got an MBA from Harvard or from INSEAD. Here's the certificate. I've been trained. There you are. Don't come to me with this nonsense. These military people are on a training course from day 1. It never ends. And they know that. And that's their attitude. It's quite distinguishable. And they don't take, we've won anything. You move forward. It's very noticeable for me. And then establish the change in the company's culture. That it's the right thing to do. It's a very important way. How are people rewarded and punished? Are they rewarded for timeliness or not for timeliness? How important is the trade-off between time and money, time and some other virtue? Because you can see what is important. You have to only look, in my book on disenchantment, I got one of my students to go to Glassdoor. Do you know what Glassdoor is? You must go and have a look at Glassdoor. Glassdoor is where pissed off people rat on their company. You're going to get a fright, maybe. It is astonishing. It is astonishing about their anger because they are mistrusted. They get very cross with what I call corporate hypocrisy. The organization says, these are our values, this is what's important to us. And you know as an employee, it's not. It's patently, obviously not. I go into the City of London, you can see these big banks with all their things on the wall, transparency and this, that, and the other. And yet the people know from day 1. Now this hacks them off. This makes them quite angry. And what you've got to realize is this idea of agility, it's a good word, and adaptation carries on because the sea changes, the things change. And so we have, one of my friends runs a consultancy called Kaizen. Kaizen, that Japanese word about improvement, ever improvement. So, I'm going to be on time. Adjusting to change, healthy adjustment, fair adjustment, poor adjustment. Some individuals don't adjust well. In my experience, 20% of people fall in the camp of, what did Mrs. Clinton call them? The basket full of deplorables. I wouldn't call them that. But I think there are those who really find that prospect of change very problematic. They're alienated from their labor. They're pissed off. They were promised something. They never got it. They always sit in the same place in the canteen. They're probably heavily unionized. They are very anti-change. Well, what can you do with them? I think you can do things with them. I think you can get them on a performance management system. You can reward them very clearly for change. You can get outsiders to do an evaluation of them, to give them feedback, because they don't believe insiders. But there will be people who find change at any age and stage difficult and problematic. I think there are ways in which you see people responding to change. Some people accept it. They accept it's necessary. You might not like it. It might be problematic. It might hurt for a bit. But in the long term, it works. Others seem just indifferent. They've heard it all before. I mean, it must be very difficult working for the British National Health Service, because the change initiatives are endless. You talk to anybody at any level. It's a very big and complicated and organization, a lot of stress. And people are more than indifferent. Sometimes they're quite hostile. They are passive resistors. And then you have active resistors. And it might be that if you're putting in a program of change where people can act as saboteurs of your organization, which they might want to do. I work with organizations where, people in your organization know secrets. They know important stuff. If you hack them off, they can do things. They can take their revenge in interesting ways. But to identify these people early on, one of the tasks I'm doing for 2 consultancy assignments at the moment is the identification of those likely to be active resistors to the problem. So, things to do in a time of change. Number 1, I think you re-engage through frequent, consistent, and honest communication. People all the time say, oh, yes, it's communication, but it is true enough. When last did you hear from the boss? Some of the people might do videos or whatever, but to have the boss pitch up. I was in the city of London the other day at a course at a bank, and the boss flew in from Switzerland. You might therefore guess what the company was. He flew in. And he was there to talk to the top 40 people. There's no substitution for it. And of course, when times are hard, things close down. Instead of communication increasing, it decreases. You've all had the experience at the airport. It's delayed. You keep going up and complaining. What happens? After a while, they just disappear off the desk. At the time you want them most, they're least there. Lead from the front. People want you to be the courageous general, to be there, to give them confidence that the change program is going to work, that it's important, that it's bold, and you are genuinely right behind it. Learn from previous recessions. Beware cutting things. Beware cutting back on certain things. I remember which airline was it which cut back on business class lounges. The airlines make their money from business class passengers. If you piss people off, there's plenty of choice. If you don't like Lufthansa, you've got a British Airways, there's plenty of choice. That one step to save costs here had enormous repercussions. So the question is, be very careful and learning from previous what to cut. You stop training, you stop marketing. Oh, those can go, they're not important. Aha, wait and see. Wait and see, and learn from the previous recession. Fix the leaks that soon appear. Go in quickly when something is going wrong. Be honest and deal with it. Innovate, get creative with your stakeholders and change. As much as possible, embrace it. And try to attract badly managed people elsewhere. The one organization of my colleagues, I said to him, what was the success? He said, you know what my success was? I found all our opponents, or our business opponents, and I found all the good managers who were hacked off, and I got them to work for us. It's a very well-known organization, this. That was the strategy. You piss off people in another organization, we'll get hold of them. And finally, prepare for economic recovery. There will be economic recovery. There will be ups and downs. It'll never change. So, ladies and gentlemen, my message. My message is that we're in perpetually a time of flux. Every generation believes they're uniquely threatened by change. You talk to your father or your grandfather, they will say the same thing. It is true, however, I think the speed of change and the complexity of change occurs. They will impact all of us all the time. Amen. I know that at the university. A university is in a very serious way because of all sorts of interesting changes. Change happens. What you need for corporate culture change is a good way of analyzing the culture, but more than that, you need managers, people who lead that from the front, who give a clear vision, who use clear strategies, who think through processes, and are believers. Then and only then will you get successful culture change. Thank you very much.